I'm Mark Smith, Director of the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina, and I'm your host for this episode of Take on the South. We begin today with weighty questions and what are, to some people, stunning answers. Question: are law enforcement agencies in South Carolina allowed to seize your money or your property, ranging from bank accounts, cash, your home, all sorts of personal property, if they simply suspect that that money or property that they have seized was used in a crime? Answer: yes. Question: can such property seizures take place even if the owner is not convicted or charged with committing a crime? Answer: yes. Question: if you are the unfortunate soul whose property is seized in this fashion, are you entitled to legal representation when seeking to get your house, cash, or personal property back? Answer: no. Question: in this situation, are you entitled to a trial by jury? Answer: no. Question: in this scenario, must the government establish proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Answer: no. This practice of property seizure in this fashion is known as civil asset forfeiture. It is not rare, and it is the law in many states, including South Carolina. How civil asset forfeiture came into being, how it works, why the system, such as it is in dire need of reform or even abolition, is the subject of today's Take on the South podcast. Joining us today to help us make sense of civil asset forfeiture in South Carolina is Ted Mauro, Chair of the South Carolina Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Ted, welcome to Take on the South.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
Before we dig in, Ted, full disclosure, Ted's the chair of the SC Advisory Committee, and I am a member along with 8 other people of this committee. And collectively, the committee released in October 2022 our report on this topic titled The Civil Right Implication of South Carolina Civil Asset Forfeiture Laws and Practices. So I'm deeply invested in this, and Ted is our chair of that committee. Ted, I know I touched on some of this in my intro, but can you tell listeners exactly what civil asset forfeiture is?
Basically, civil asset forfeiture is the attempts by law enforcement to seize assets that they believe were the result of illegal activity. However, the unique component of it is that it's not part of the criminal procedures, but part of the civil procedures. It is not in the criminal courts, but over in the civil courts. So there's several elements to civil trials that are completely different. And, generally, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, it is really focused, the Bill of Rights is focused upon the issues around criminal procedures. So the protections, as you mentioned in the introduction, to the average citizen in the civil courts is much less, because ultimately it's a situation where the burden of proof is so much lower.
Yeah. So the key word in this is really civil.
Yes.
Right. So and we'll get to that in a bit, how it might change. But when this was first brought up as a possible topic for the commission to look at, it was almost breathtaking that it even existed. And it's not that it's uncommon, it's just that it's poorly articulated or understood. So can you say something about the origins of this civil asset forfeiture? I mean, where did it come from, Ted, and why does it still have legs?
Well, ultimately, if you look at our committee and our approach, we really are an advisory committee, and we're made up of citizens of South Carolina of all types, all ages, all backgrounds. And really what it comes down to is we really are looking at issues that have that shock value. We look at things that the average person would find out about and scratch their head and say, why is this still going on? The reason why it's still going on is because it's profitable. It's the ability for law enforcement to seize assets and to make them their own. with very little oversight, which was the particularly disturbing part to me. I had read the Taken series from the Greenville News and Anderson Independent here in South Carolina. I highly recommend people go to it, and read these stories of all these people who've had their assets seized, beaten up pickup trucks. I looked and saw pictures of kids' bikes that weren't even working, in working condition, that were seized. And it really blows a person's mind that in this day and time that government can seize assets, and then the individual has to go and fight and get it back.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing. You're entirely right. I think that's a very apt description. As part of the Commission's work and part of what we did, we're very careful to represent both sides, or at least hear from both sides. There are some people who believe that civil asset forfeiture is appropriate and helpful, and there are some people, including the law enforcement community, who believe that it's not helpful.
Correct.
Where did this come from, though, Ted? I mean, why is there civil asset forfeiture even on the books?
Well, I think an excellent source to learn about the history of it is the South Carolina Supreme Court's ruling on civil asset forfeiture. And in it, you'll see they really basically talk about it going back to maritime law and privateers. And this idea that government could seize ships that had violated some sort of declaration of the seas. And from that, civil asset forfeiture really was this idea that it empowered government to stop the proceeds from illegal trade, be it bootleggers. You had an excellent series on constables and the unique role that bootlegging has in this state, and it really is a way in which, in these tight fiscal times, government can make money. Mm-hmm. And the not only the fact that this happens, but the oversight and what happens to that money itself is also mind-blowing, in the sense that there are instances where the officers who seized these assets then proceeded to use civil forfeiture assets to purchase the actual things taken. Mm-hmm. Right? Trucks, for instance, and not just drugs and cash seized, but the original idea was to go after drug dealers. And we're not talking here Lear jets. We're talking beat up pickup trucks. Originally, it was this idea. What really happened, if you look at the history, it seems that as the assets, the smaller assets are the ones that people really don't go to court for. Mm-hmm. I mean, why would I hire a lawyer, spend $1,000 or $2,000 to seize a pickup truck that's worth $600? It just doesn't make sense. And because of that, that really is what led to our present situation. And I know you were as shocked as I was when we looked at the stats of what type of assets are seized. And you saw it yourself, the value of those assets.
So like many things, they begin with a good intention, and this was designed in the 70s and 80s and going into the 90s to really seize the assets of drug traffickers in particular. And Correct. We're talking, the aim there was large-scale items, jets, boats, you name
DEA, 1980s, the idea of, a drug courier profile, this whole movement in law enforcement to attempt to address the issues of crack cocaine and addictive drugs.
Yeah, so it was born of a very particular moment, federal and state, right? And we'll get into that in a bit.
And a true need.
Yeah, and a true need. Over time, what's happened, or what appears to have happened at least, is a contortion, a manipulation, and really a departure from the original idea of this, in which it's not Learjets, it's not boats, it's cars, it's
rotting lawnmowers,
yeah. Pretty much, and also people's houses, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are not just small items that can be taken.
No.
I mean, it is perfectly possible, and I want to unpack this a bit just so that listeners understand how this works. So, Ted, let's just say you're driving down the road, maybe, I don't know, part of I-95 in South Carolina, and, you might be pulled over under suspicion of, I don't know, a driver's license issue, what have you, right?
Sure. Or your child. or your grandchild is pulled over in the car that you bought them and kept under your name.
Right. So there's a suspicion, a probable cause, and you're pulled over.
Illegal lane change.
Right. Illegal lane change. Okay. The police officer in that circumstance then does what to lead to civil asset forfeiture?
Well, ultimately, the procedures, reasonable suspicion, the idea of a legal stop then moves to the area of a search. And the search is covered under the Fifth Amendment. And there is this idea that there are protections through criminal procedures, which most people are pretty aware of. Mm-hmm. However, what's happened is instead of staying on that track of the criminal side, when the case isn't strong enough, mm-hmm. right? Or it's a situation where, there might have been a problem with the criminal side of the case, an illegal search or something. Mm-hmm. Now it's been moved to the civil side. Right. You're being sued. It's seized, and actually you're suing government. I'm sorry, you're suing government, really. They're going to take an asset. You have to go to the civil courts, and you have to file a suit to get your stuff.
So the onus becomes yours.
Exactly.
Right.
You become the plaintiff.
So the property's seized, and then you have to kind of try to get it back through the court system, the civil court system.
Correct.
Is there a particular group, Ted, that's more affected by civil asset forfeiture in South Carolina than other groups?
It seems, and again, this is so difficult to talk about because the reporting requirements are nil. When we got this issue at the commission, when this article was written, I mean, like any group, we immediately said, okay, this sounds unusual. Let's take a closer look at this issue. And then it became almost impossible. The Greenville News had spent almost 2 years investigating this all over the state of South Carolina and the Anderson Independent. However, when I attempted to follow up with their data gathering, when I attempted to say, well, is this a continuing pattern? Mm-hmm. Is this an issue of demographics? Are there, what are there, men or women? What are the age of these people? Are there college graduates, high school graduates? Are they people of color? Or are they people who, I try to get my hands around this issue and see, is this really a civil rights issue? I was stymied because there was no way to find out this information. So ultimately, the real challenge is we don't know. All we know is that assets are being taken, that the overwhelming majority of them are being taken from people who are the least likely to fight in court to get them back, and assets of a value which makes it questionable if you even wanted to fight to get it back. Mm-hmm.
So this transparency issue is very important because there is no central authority where you can say, could you tell us how much property has been seized, what it's worth, how many times you've done this? That just simply doesn't exist, correct?
If I wanted to know how many chainsaws were taken, I could not tell you.
Right.
And no one could.
But we did our work, and you did a lot of research on this in particular, and there were some conclusions that we came to courtesy of the limited statistical data that we have, and also interviews with a variety of people, victims, law enforcement officers themselves, sheriffs.
Yes.
And what were some of those findings that you discovered?
Well, ultimately, if you take a look at our report, you're going to see that there's really questions about the value of the item. So it seems that overwhelmingly it's under $1,000. And 500, even under 500, I think it was about a third of those were under $500 assets. And as you mentioned, not just directly tied to crime, but it seems that about 68 to 70% of the seized assets at those levels were people of color, particularly African-American males. Mm-hmm. And, there was one in particular that comes to mind was a gentleman who was driving through Spartanburg, Greenville area, who was part of this Rolling Thunder seizure that's been taking place out there, who was on his way from Atlanta to Charlotte, was a musician, was a DJ. So he had cash because that's what he gets paid in. Mm-hmm. He gets paid in cash. And because of that, they were stopped. The drug dog hit on the car. They found no drugs in the car, but needless to say, they took the cash. And, for a guy like that, who, to turn around and want to come back for under $1,000 worth of cash, which then the cash, we really don't know what happens to it. There are no reporting requirements of what happens to that money and how it's spent, either from solicitors or sheriffs or police. It's just really rubs people wrong. Even if, I'm a person who supports law enforcement and their job. And to me, it almost came off as degrading that police officers are being sent out there to grab assets for under $1,000 and for funding purposes. We as a people, as taxpayers, owe law enforcement the proper funding so they don't have to go out there and do this. It hurts them, it hurts the people who have their assets seized, and it hurts our justice system. When the police are being forced to search for revenue, justice suffers. And ultimately, that's what I got from our report, was that justice is suffering in this scenario, and we could do better.
Nicely put. So a couple of points there, just to highlight them or accent them. The African-American population in South Carolina is about 27%, but they account for 68% or higher of every civil asset forfeiture. So there's a disproportional impact. Secondly, is there a correlation between declines in state funding for law enforcement and increase in civil asset forfeiture? In other words, is it a direct funding mechanism for lots of, especially small police departments? I mean, how else are they going to buy their cruisers? How else are they going to buy their equipment? Is this what's funding this, Ted?
That financial incentive is really, as I mentioned, just it's degrading to law enforcement to put them in that position.
It's degrading to everyone, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's kind of one of those things that if somebody told you this, you probably wouldn't believe it, and that's the kind of the shock value of this. No transparency, no public databases. We can't even track it.
No convictions.
No convictions.
No charges.
Well, very few people who are charged with civil asset forfeiture actually are proven guilty, right? Very few.
Absolutely. Even the Supreme Court case, the South Carolina Supreme Court case, I mean, that was a seizure of a large amount of money. But, most of these cases, we're never going to find out.
Yeah. I mean, I remember during our conversations with, when we're interviewing various witnesses to sort of mold our report, I think I said to one of them, does this strike you as distinctly un-American? And because it does me,
right.
I mean, property is important in the enshrouded in the American Constitution, but it seems to be suspended in this instance.
It's on capitalism.
It's very odd.
The personal property, private property is the backbone of our system.
It's sure, and not just the state system, but the federal system. And
yes.
I want to move on to what is the connection, because there's federal civil asset forfeiture, and every state has it too.
Yes.
But there is an intimate and perturbing relationship between the federal system and the state system, and it's called equitable sharing. Could you tell our listeners something about equitable sharing?
There is how these assets and the financial gain from these assets is divided is really very questionable, in the sense of it not only rewards local law enforcement to work with the federal element, but then the reward is financial from the feds back to local agencies for seizing assets. And I think you're right. I think that the ultimate challenge is this something we want to do as a people? And the federal grabbing and the federal interaction with the states and local, it's important. And again, yachts should be seized. Lear jets should be seized. But we're really in a situation here where the federal government itself has at least some guidelines. I mean, if we even just took the federal guidelines, including the reporting requirements, South Carolina would be ahead of where it is now.
No, so there are federal guidelines for this, right?
There are reporting requirements.
But not for every state. That very much depends on the state you're in.
No, and in some instances, the feds, from what we understand, and we've called upon the United States Commission of Civil Rights as a whole to investigate this issue closer. When they pass off a case, it allows the local agency then to take it over the federal side of it and use it for assets.
And to be very clear about this, this is not a partisan issue. Is that correct?
No. It's bipartisan. I highly recommend people go and see some of the videos from the Taken series. You'll see libertarians. I shared with you an article from Forbes magazine. Mm-hmm. It's really about property rights in many people's eyes and the seizure of property without due process of law.
Yeah, it's almost incredible that we can have this conversation, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
So we issued the report last month, and could you take our listeners through some of the recommendations of the report? In other words, there's a big push, the push from a federal level, some states to reform, if not get rid of this system. But our recommendations were largely about reforming the system. Is that right?
Well, and that's because we listened to law enforcement, right. And they did feel that it was a valuable tool for them.
Yeah.
And if you remember, they mentioned it, they compared it to tickets, mm-hmm. and the difference between a speed trap, a location where tickets are consistently handed out, yeah. which South Carolina unfortunately has had a history of as well, but unlike other states, not unlike other states who do the similar thing.
Sure.
That a guideline like one sheriff mentioned $1,000, mm-hmm. right? That an asset under $1,000 wouldn't be seized. You'll see some other that the requirement of a conviction. Mm-hmm. South Carolina has a very good legal system in the sense of, when you've got a victim and reparations or some sort of compensation to a victim. The criminal system is very good at seizing assets, and some states have recommended, and we did as well, that these ideas that it move away from local areas of small to highly effective and let's say highly complex criminal organizations. Mm-hmm. We don't want to tie, in my opinion, and other committee members had a different opinion, we don't want to tie the hands of going after big-time drug dealers who are bringing in assets, fentanyl and other things from outside. But we do want to put a limit on how, the under $1,000. I think we have to have some sort of demographic information. We have to know what assets are being seized by who. And it would seem that sheriffs, solicitors, even the state itself should be reporting this on a public database. The inability to find out more, mm-hmm. and the transparency around it is something that needs to be concern of any.
So this is not about hobbling or disadvantaging law enforcement agencies to do their job, which we recognize as important.
Absolutely.
It's more about kind of emancipating the average citizen from the abuse of the system.
I see it as funding law enforcement, a call to fund law enforcement, yep. so they don't have to do these things.
That's right. That's right. So the state should take a much more robust approach and fund their law enforcement fully, and you wouldn't need these very small amounts that add up to quite a lot, but they're small amounts for individuals.
Well, and particularly the impact on the people, right? If somebody is having an asset of if their truck is worth less than $1,000, I mean, that loss of that truck and those tools in that truck, I mean, it
could be catastrophic.
Oh, gosh, yes.
But now, of course, somebody would say to you, well, Ted, fine, but why don't you just go to an attorney to get your property back?
I don't know an attorney who would take that case.
Exactly, because the proportion is so small and it's civil.
Correct.
So very few attorneys would take these cases. You really have to do it yourself, and the chances of you prevailing in terms of the number of hours you're committing to this are pretty remote.
Sure, and on top of it, with 95% of criminal cases being, settled in plea deals anyway,
yeah, right.
The case itself must be pretty weak.
So the Commission's report, at least the South Carolina Commission's report, was we need transparency.
Absolutely.
Right? We need to be able to track this. We need to be able to report it. We need to be able to
keep an eye on its effect on low-income minority communities, right? We certainly need to have, of course, this idea that there has to be some oversight and protections, right? I saw some states, if you go to the website and invite people to go to the website for the United States Commission on Civil Rights, you'll see reports from Tennessee, New Jersey, New Mexico, and they all have similar ideas that the majority of cases that there should, if there is not an arrest, right, arrest.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
There's not even enough evidence, to arrest someone. Then seizing their assets seems pretty draconian.
Indeed. Would a solution be to shift this from civil to criminal? Would that be one? Because at least that way you'd have due protection. You could have an attorney. You could have a trial by jury. Is that a viable solution for this issue?
I believe so. Ultimately, again, law enforcement looks at this as, now I have to build a case. Mm-hmm. And maybe I have a hunch. It's interesting, how often law enforcement has a hunch and they have a belief, but proving it is such a hard part. I think because of the dangerous place we're here, with the seizing of assets by government, we have no other choice. Mm-hmm. I hate to tie law enforcement's hands in this situation, but the fact of the matter is it was always intended to be on the criminal side. Yep. It is intended those protections under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights apply to the criminal side, and ultimately it seems that that's where it belongs. And the ability, right, to have a public defender, public defender, and the solicitor to have his input as well.
I mean, I'm sure that the counter argument is that, well, the criminal courts are clogged already. It would just make it coagulated beyond function. But that's not really the issue. The issue is about justice and getting it right.
And going after crime syndicates.
Right. That's exactly right. Ted, now that the report has been released, what is the South Carolina Advisory Committee going to do next?
Great question, Mark. That's up to the committee members to come up with, and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say. I have a couple ideas, and again, I'm just one member. It's up to the committee, but it certainly seems that the role of parole has been something that's been looked at closely, and to me, one of the biggest challenges has been the inability of people to pay for their parole. There's a lot of expenses there, and people can't get off parole, if they can't pay their fines, and that ties to voting rights. So that's one issue. I certainly think that I've heard a lot of people talking about predatory lending, and particularly around student loans. That is something that has concerned me, but again, it's up to the committee members. We've had some questions about labor and Starbucks and labor law in this state, and about the role of organized labor. It's becoming more popular, and it's an unpopular word in South Carolina. However, there does need to be protections of workers, in my opinion, but that might be something we'd be interested in. And again, it's a bipartisan committee, so ultimately it's up to everyone. Finally, one that's personally important to me is the denial of mental health services to people with disabilities. We came out with a report on minimum wages for people with disabilities, and when I found out that a person who's receiving services for the Department of Disabilities and Special Needs doesn't have access to mental health services, it seemed to me that was really an issue that needs to be looked at. However, again, these are just some ideas, and committee members like yourself and the public, all our meetings are open to the public.
Right. And we invite the public to participate in these meetings.
Certainly. And if you look at the history of the committee, originally it was really about specific issues and investigation of specific issues, but we've really moved to the general issues that should concern all South Carolina.
So there are lots of possible issues that the committee might address. This one the report's just been released, and over the coming months there
Correct.
will be increasing
and there's
volume.
legislative action out there. The important part of the Supreme Court ruling was this idea that it was a political issue and had to be taken care of by the politicians. So that really is a call for public input.
Yeah, that's precisely the conclusion that the Supreme Court came to, wasn't it? This is not really a judicial question. This is a political one. It originated there and it needs to be resolved there. And so ultimately, the future of civil asset forfeiture does not reside with judges.
No.
It doesn't reside with politicians. It actually resides with us. We are the will of the people.
Sir. And again, I think that law enforcement also needs to be part of the conversation, and the solicitors and the public defenders and the average citizen here in South Carolina really needs to ask itself, are we going to fund the police to the levels that they need to perform their jobs in the 21st century?
Nicely put, Ted Mauro. My thanks for a truly astonishing and depressing story expertly told. Thank you for being on Take on the
Thank you so
South.
much for having me, Mark.
My pleasure.